Welcome to Calm Mysteries, a quiet place where forgotten history, lost kingdoms, and unsolved secrets drift softly through time. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, relax, and let the past carry you gently into sleep. The final letter of a forgotten scholar. The lamp oil burned low in the clay vessel, casting trembling shadows across the worn wooden desk, where Marcus Cornelius Viridius sat hunched over a piece of parchment that would never reach its intended destination. His fingers, gnarled and stained with decades of ink, trembled as they gripped the reed pen. Outside the narrow window of his modest chambers in the outer district of Constantinople, the city prepared for sleep as the bells of Hagia Sophia marked the hour, the 9th bell of the evening on the 14th day of March, in the year of our Lord, 1348. Marcus had lived 63 years, and for 42 of those years he had dedicated himself to a singular obsession that had consumed his fortune, his reputation, and ultimately his peace. Now, as the plague crept through the streets below, the same pestilence that had already claimed his wife, his 2 sons, and his daughter, he understood with bitter clarity that his life's work would die with him unless he could complete this final accounting. The letter began simply, as all his scholarly correspondence had, to whom it may concern in ages yet unborn. He had no illusions that his contemporaries would understand or value what he had discovered. The learned men of the church had already dismissed him as a heretic. The philosophers at the university considered him mad. Even his fellow scribes in the imperial library, where he had worked for 27 years before his dismissal, whispered that he had lost his mind chasing phantoms in ancient texts. But Marcus knew better. He had found something that changed everything, a pattern woven through history that suggested human civilization was far older and far more cyclical than anyone dared imagine. The evidence lay scattered across hundreds of documents he had collected, copied, and analyzed. Fragments of Sumerian tablets, Egyptian papyri, Greek manuscripts, Roman records, and even stranger texts from traveling merchants who brought whispers of knowledge from Cathay and the lands beyond the eastern seas. His discovery had begun innocently enough, 3 decades earlier, when he was a young scribe of 31, ambitious and hungry for knowledge. The head librarian had assigned him to catalogue and copy a collection of damaged texts recovered from a monastery fire in Anatolia. Among the charred fragments, Marcus had found a peculiar astronomical record kept by an unknown monk who had lived during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, some 800 years prior. The monk had documented a series of celestial observations that didn't match the established calendar. At first, Marcus assumed simple error, but the precision of the measurements suggested otherwise. The monk had recorded the positions of stars and planets with remarkable accuracy, and had noted something disturbing. Certain stellar configurations he observed had, according to ancient sources he cited, appeared in exactly the same positions 1,440 years before his own time. This should have been impossible. The precession of the equinoxes, known since the time of Hipparchus of Nicaea in the 2nd century before Christ, meant that stellar positions gradually shifted over centuries. For the same configuration to appear twice required either a much faster precession cycle than believed, or the ancient records were wrong, or And this was the thought that had seized Marcus's imagination. The ancient records were far more ancient than anyone supposed. Intrigued, Marcus had begun searching for similar anomalies. His position in the Imperial Library gave him access to one of the world's greatest collections of ancient texts. He spent his spare hours, and then his working hours, and eventually every waking moment, tracing references backward through time. A Roman agricultural text from the 1st century cited Egyptian farming techniques from the time of the Great Alignment. An Egyptian papyrus from the Ptolemaic period referenced Sumerian star mapping from the age when the bull watched the spring. Sumerian tablets spoke of knowledge inherited from the black-headed people of the time before the flood. Each thread led backward, and each suggested the same unsettling conclusion. Human civilization possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, not just hundreds, but thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years before the accepted chronologies allowed. The Great Flood mentioned in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Greek myths, and the Mesopotamian epics wasn't just a moral tale. It was a memory of a real catastrophe that had destroyed an earlier, advanced civilization, leaving only scattered survivors to rebuild. Marcus had initially approached the church scholars with his findings, naively believing they would share his excitement. He was 34 years old when he first presented his research to a gathering of learned clerics at the monastery of Stodios. He had prepared his arguments carefully, marshalling evidence from Scripture itself. Didn't the book of Genesis speak of giants in the earth in those days? Didn't the apocryphal book of Enoch describe fallen angels teaching mankind the secrets of astronomy, metallurgy, and writing? The response had been swift and brutal. He was denounced as a heretic for suggesting that human civilization predated the biblical account of creation, which placed the world's origin in the year 4004 before Christ, less than 5,400 years in the past. His interpretation of Scripture was deemed dangerous. He was forbidden from teaching or publishing his theories. Undeterred, Marcus had turned to the secular philosophers at the university. Surely they, devoted to reason and natural philosophy, would appreciate his empirical approach. He was 36 when he presented his evidence to a symposium of the city's greatest minds. He showed them the astronomical records, the linguistic connections between ancient languages that suggested a common, older source, the mathematical ratios encoded in ancient architecture that demonstrated knowledge of geometry and trigonometry that supposedly hadn't been discovered until the time of Pythagoras in the 6th century before Christ. The philosophers had been more polite than the clerics, but no less dismissive. His methods were called unsound. His sources were deemed unreliable copies of copies, corrupted by centuries of scribal error. The patterns he saw were attributed to coincidence or his own desperate desire to find meaning where none existed. One respected teacher of rhetoric had summed up the consensus. You see connections because you wish to see them, Marcus. You are finding the face of God in random clouds. The rejection stung. Marcus couldn't abandon his work. The evidence kept accumulating. At 39, he discovered a merchant's log from the 4th century before Christ that described a trade route to Britain, where the locals possessed astronomical stone circles already ancient in that writer's time. At 41, he found a fragment of a Phoenician text claiming their alphabet was derived from an older system of symbols used by a seafaring people who had disappeared when the island sank. and the waters rose. His obsession began to cost him. His wife, Helena, had been patient at first. She had married a promising young scholar with prospects for advancement in the imperial bureaucracy. She found herself instead bound to a man who spent every copper coin on acquiring obscure manuscripts, who stayed awake through the night poring over ancient texts by lamplight, who spoke incessantly of lost civilizations and cosmic cycles that no one else believed existed. Their 3 children, Theodora, Constantine, and young Marcus, grew up in genteel poverty despite their father's education. Marcus the Elder spent his salary from the library on texts instead of food, on travel to distant monasteries, to examine their collections, instead of proper clothing for his family. Helena took in sewing to make ends meet, her resentment growing with each passing year. When Marcus was 45, his superiors at the Imperial Library finally lost patience. His cataloguing work had fallen behind as he pursued his private research. He was discovered one night, without authorization, in the restricted section where the most ancient and valuable texts were kept, carefully copying a Chaldean astronomical text that the church had ordered sealed because it contradicted the approved chronology. He was dismissed from his position in disgrace. For the next 18 years, Marcus had survived by taking whatever scribal work he could find, copying legal documents, writing letters for illiterate merchants, teaching basic Latin and Greek to the sons of shopkeepers. The income was irregular and insufficient. They moved from their modest but respectable home to increasingly cheaper lodgings in rougher districts. Helena's health deteriorated from the strain and poor conditions. Theodora married at 16 to escape the poverty, wedding a baker's apprentice. Constantine left at 17 to join a merchant vessel, seeking fortune at sea. Young Marcus, showing his father's scholarly inclinations, remained and tried to help, but opportunities for a poor man's son were limited. Through it all, the elder Marcus continued his research, now entirely at his own expense and in complete isolation from the academic community. He had developed a comprehensive theory. Human civilization moved in vast cycles. Advanced societies rose, achieved great heights of knowledge, then fell to catastrophe, whether natural disasters, climate changes, wars, or plagues. The survivors, reduced to primitive conditions, slowly rebuilt over millennia, eventually rediscovering much of what had been lost, but rarely acknowledging that they were retracing ancient paths. He identified what he believed were at least 3 previous cycles of civilization before the current era. The first, impossibly ancient, had left only the faintest traces, certain stone structures found from Egypt to the Americas that showed similar architectural principles despite being separated by vast oceans. The second, perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 years before his time, had achieved sophisticated astronomy and mathematics, knowledge of which had trickled down through priesthoods and mystery schools in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The third cycle had ended with the catastrophe remembered as the Great Flood, approximately 3,000 years before Christ, a real event caused by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, not the divine punishment of Scripture, though the moral interpretation had been added later. Marcus had compiled all of this into a massive manuscript he called The Eternal Return, a chronicle of forgotten ages. It ran to more than 800 pages of closely written text, supported by hundreds of references to ancient sources, astronomical calculations, linguistic analyses, and architectural measurements he had personally taken at ancient sites during rare journeys he could afford. No publisher would touch it. No patron would fund its completion. No institution would house it. The church considered it heretical. The university deemed it pseudo-scholarship. Even his former friends and colleagues avoided him, embarrassed by association with a man they considered a failed scholar, clinging to a delusional theory. Then, in the year 1347, the plague arrived in Constantinople, carried on ships from the Black Sea ports. It spread through the crowded, unsanitary districts with terrifying speed. Helena, weakened by years of poverty and hard work, was among the first in their neighborhood to fall ill. She died within 4 days, in agony, her body covered with the characteristic black swellings that gave the pestilence its name. She was 58 years old. Constantine, who had returned from sea only weeks before his mother's death, nursed her through her final days. He contracted the disease himself and followed her to the grave within a fortnight. He was 34. Young Marcus, now 29 and recently married with a newborn daughter, tried to flee the city with his small family. They made it only as far as the city walls before the symptoms appeared. All 3 perished in a pest house outside the Carisius gate. Marcus, his wife Anna, and their infant daughter, who had lived only 42 days and bore her grandmother's name, Helena. Theodora, safe in a rural village where her baker husband had a cousin, sent word begging her father to come to them, to escape the dying city. But Marcus Cornelius Viridius would not leave. His great manuscript was here, along with all his supporting documents, his references, his calculations. To abandon them would be to admit that his entire adult life had been wasted. Besides, at 63, having lost everything that had once mattered more than his work, he felt a strange liberation. If he was to die, and he had no illusions that anyone would escape the plague forever, he would die completing his life's purpose. But what was that purpose now? Who would read his manuscript after he was gone? Who would understand it? Who would preserve it? The university certainly wouldn't. The church would likely burn it. Even his own daughter, who loved him but had never understood his obsession, wouldn't know what to do with 800 pages of what most would consider mad ravings. This realization had come to Marcus 2 weeks ago, as he stood in the empty rooms where his family had lived, Helena's sewing basket still sitting in the corner, Constantine's seed chest unopened against the wall, little Marcus's few books stacked neatly on a shelf. The plague had taken everything that connected him to the ordinary world of human affection and daily life. All that remained was the work, and the work, he understood with crushing clarity, would die with him, unless he did something different, unless he abandoned the comprehensive proof he had spent 4 decades assembling and instead distilled everything into something simpler, more direct, more likely to survive. Not a scholarly treatise that required specialized knowledge to appreciate, but a letter, a message, a warning and a remembrance sent forward through time to whoever might find it, whenever that might be. So he had begun this final effort, pouring everything he knew into a document designed not for the scholars of his own age, who had already rejected him, but for unknown readers in some future time, who might be ready to understand. He wrote of his discoveries, but also of his life, his struggles, his mistakes. He wrote with the freedom of a man who had nothing left to lose, and no reputation left to protect. The lamp flickered, drawing Marcus back to the present moment. he realized he had been lost in memory, the pen motionless in his hand for several minutes. How much time did he have left? The plague was everywhere now. He had already felt the first symptoms 3 days ago. The fever, the aching joints, the terrible fatigue. So far he had avoided the swellings, but he knew they could appear at any time. He dipped his pen in the ink and continued writing, his hand moving with renewed urgency across the parchment. I write this, knowing I will soon join my beloved Helena and my children in death. The pestilence that has devastated this city has likely already claimed me, though I still draw breath. But before the end comes, I must set down what I have learned, not in the hope that my contemporaries will believe me. They have made clear they will not. But for you, unknown reader of some future age, who may have the wisdom to see what my generation refused to acknowledge. We are not the first. This is the essential truth that all my research confirms. The civilization we inhabit, which traces its glory to Rome and Athens and Jerusalem, which measures its age in mere thousands of years, stands upon foundations far more ancient than we admit. We are not the builders, but the inheritors, not the discoverers, but the rediscoverers. And we have forgotten this fact so completely that to speak it is to invite ridicule and condemnation. I have traced the evidence through every source available to me over 42 years of research. The astronomical records from Sumeria and Babylon contain observations that predate the supposed origin of those civilizations by thousands of years. The mathematical knowledge encoded in Egyptian pyramids and temples demonstrates understanding of pi, the golden ratio, and the precession of the equinoxes that the Greeks supposedly discovered millennia later. The megalithic structures found across the world, from Britain to the Mediterranean to lands beyond the eastern seas, show engineering capabilities that our own age struggles to replicate, yet they are attributed to primitive peoples with stone tools. How is this possible? The answer my research has revealed is both simple and profound. There have been earlier civilizations, advanced in their own ways, which rose to great heights and then fell to catastrophe. The survivors, reduced to small numbers and primitive conditions, slowly rebuilt over generations and centuries, eventually developing writing and cities and learning once more. But in the process of rebuilding, the memory of what came before was lost, preserved only in myths and legends that we now dismiss as mere fantasy. The Great Flood described in the scriptures of the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Mesopotamians, and according to travelers' reports, peoples in distant lands. This was not divine punishment, but natural catastrophe. The end of the last ice age, approximately 3,000 years before Christ, brought massive flooding as the glaciers melted and sea levels rose. Coastal civilizations, wherever they existed, would have been devastated. Entire cities, entire cultures, swallowed by the sea. The survivors would have fled inland, carrying only what they could rescue, including fragments of knowledge from the lost world. This explains the curious distribution of flood myths across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. This explains why ancient texts from Sumeria and Egypt speak of receiving wisdom from the time before the waters rose. This explains the legends in Greece of Atlantis and other sunken lands. Not fantasy, but folk memory of real places destroyed by real catastrophe. But the flooding was not the first catastrophe, nor will it be the last. My astronomical research suggests a pattern of climate cycles and celestial events that recur over vast periods of time. Every 10,800 years, approximately, the Earth's axis shifts slightly in its precession, altering the climate patterns. Every few thousand years, the sun itself seems to enter periods of decreased activity, bringing cold and crop failures, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, meteor impacts. All of these have struck before and will strike again. Each time civilization rises, it eventually faces such a catastrophe, and each time the survivors must start again, losing much of what was known before. We measure our current age from the Greeks and Romans, forgetting that they measured their wisdom from the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, who in turn preserved fragments from even earlier peoples whose names we have forgotten entirely. I know how this sounds. I know what the learned men of my age say about such claims. I have heard all the arguments against my theory, that I am seeing patterns that don't exist, that I am misinterpreting ancient texts, that I am ignoring the clear testimony of Scripture regarding the age and origin of the world. I have been called fool, heretic, madman. My own family suffered for my obsession with these ideas. But I cannot deny what I have seen in the texts themselves. When a Sumerian priest writes about receiving astronomical knowledge from the sages before the flood, I cannot dismiss this as mere legend when his astronomical observations are accurate. When an Egyptian papyrus describes the construction of temples using mathematical ratios we supposedly only discovered in Greece, I cannot pretend this is coincidence. When megalithic structures in Britain align precisely with celestial events using engineering principles we can barely replicate, I cannot accept that primitive tribesmen with stone axes built them. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look without prejudice. But prejudice is strong. The prejudice of believing we are special, that our civilization is the first and greatest, that we are the summit of human achievement, rather than one more peak in an endless cycle of rising and falling. This is what I have come to understand in my 63 years, and especially in these final days as I watch my world die around me. The plague that now devastates Constantinople is not unique in history. Such pestilences have come before and will come again. They are part of the cycle, one of the mechanisms by which civilization is periodically reduced. Knowledge is lost, and humanity must rebuild. We will recover from this plague, just as we recovered from the flood, just as we have recovered from ice ages and droughts and volcanic winters, and all the other catastrophes that have struck. But in recovering, we will forget much. Already I see it happening. Libraries burning as plague fearful mobs attack anything they think might spread contagion, scholars dying with their knowledge unrecorded, books and manuscripts mouldering in abandoned buildings. When this generation dies, the next will inherit a diminished world. They will rebuild, as humans always do, but they will have lost things we now take for granted, and in time they will think of our age as we think of ancient Sumeria, impressive but limited, superseded by their own superior civilization. They will not realize they are merely recovering what was known before. Unless someone remembers, unless someone preserves the truth, unless someone writes it down and hides it away for future discovery, when perhaps humanity will be ready to understand the pattern that governs our existence. That is what I attempt now, in this letter that may never be read, written by a forgotten scholar in a dying city in the winter of his life. I am not trying to prove my theory with comprehensive evidence. That attempt failed. I am simply witnessing to the truth as I have come to understand it, in the hope that someday someone will find this testimony and recognize it for what it is. Not the ravings of a madman, but the careful observations of a man who looked honestly at the evidence before him and drew conclusions that his age was not ready to accept. Let me describe what I found in the texts themselves, the specific evidence that convinced me of the great age of human knowledge. I will begin with astronomy, as this was the thread that first unraveled the accepted chronology in my mind. Marcus paused to rest his aching hand. The fever was getting worse. He could feel it burning in his blood, but he had to continue. There was so much more to explain, and time was running short. He flexed his fingers, dipped the pen once more, and pressed on. The ancient peoples were obsessed with the stars, and rightly so. In ages before our modern comforts, before our cities blocked the night sky with their lights and smoke, the heavens dominated the darkness. Every culture developed astronomy, but the sophistication of their observations varied wildly, or so we are taught. The Greeks invented systematic astronomy, we are told. The Babylonians made useful observations, but lacked true understanding. The Egyptians had crude star maps. Everything before was primitive sky watching by ignorant shepherds. This narrative satisfied me when I was young. Then I actually read the ancient texts instead of just accepting what scholars said about them. I found astronomical records from Babylon that track the movements of Venus with such precision that they could predict its appearances and disappearances years in advance. I found Egyptian temple alignments that accounted for the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon supposedly unknown until Hipparchus discovered it in the 2nd century before Christ. Yet the temples were built 1,000 years earlier, and their orientations clearly compensated for precession. Most astonishing were the Sumerian and Babylonian records of the precessional cycle itself. The precession of the equinoxes is caused by a wobble in Earth's axis that makes the stars appear to shift their positions very slowly over time. The complete cycle takes 25,920 years. Yet Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium before Christ describe this cycle and divide it into 12 ages of 2,160 years each, corresponding to the 12 constellations of the zodiac. How did they know this? To observe a complete precessional cycle requires continuous astronomical record-keeping over 25,920 years. Even to observe enough of the cycle to calculate its full period requires many thousands of years of records. Yet the Sumerians, who supposedly invented writing only around 3,200 before Christ, possessed this knowledge. The only possible explanation is that they inherited it from an earlier tradition, a tradition that had been observing and recording the heavens for 10,000 years or more. When I pointed this out to the philosophers at the university, they suggested the Sumerian records were poetic fiction, not actual astronomy. But the numbers are too precise to be fiction. The cycle period they describe matches almost exactly what modern observations confirm. This is not lucky guessing. This is inherited knowledge from an older source. The same pattern appears in mathematics. The Babylonians used a base 60 number system. That is, they counted in groups of 60 rather than our base 10 system using fingers. This seems odd until you realize that 60 is a highly practical number for mathematics because it divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes calculations much easier than base 10, which only divides evenly by 2, 5, and 10. We still use base 60 for measuring time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, because the Babylonian system was so superior for these purposes. But here is what troubles me. Developing such a system requires sophisticated mathematical thinking and a practical need for complex calculations. Why would early Mesopotamian farmers need this? They wouldn't. But navigators making long sea voyages would. Astronomers tracking celestial movements would. Engineers designing complex structures would. The Babylonian mathematical system makes sense if it was developed by or inherited from a civilization that needed it for advanced purposes: navigation, astronomy, engineering. It makes less sense if we believe it was invented by the first humans to settle in Mesopotamia and farm the river valleys. Where did they get such advanced concepts? The answer I have come to is the same. They inherited it from before. Architecture provides further evidence. The Great Pyramids of Egypt have been studied extensively, and the more precisely we measure them, the more remarkable they become. The base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu is level to within less than 1 inch across 755 feet, a precision that would challenge modern builders. The sides are oriented to the cardinal directions, with an error of less than 1/15 of a single degree. The ratios embedded in its dimensions encode P and the golden ratio, suggesting the builders possess knowledge of advanced mathematics. Orthodox scholars argue that the Egyptians of the 4th dynasty, around 2560 before Christ, built these structures through brute force and simple tools. But this explanation grows harder to accept the more you examine the evidence. Some of the stone blocks weigh 70 tons or more. They were quarried, transported, and lifted into place with supposedly nothing more than copper tools, wooden rollers, and rope. I have spoken with stonemasons and builders, practical men who work with stone every day. They tell me that cutting and placing blocks of such size and weight with primitive tools would require not just great numbers of workers, but also engineering knowledge far beyond what we attribute to ancient Egypt. The precision of the cutting, the tight joints between blocks, the internal chambers and passages, all of these suggest builders who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before. What if the 4th dynasty Egyptians didn't build the pyramids from scratch, rather rebuilt or restored structures that were far older? What if they were maintaining monuments from an earlier age, monuments already ancient in their time? This would explain why the later pyramids are cruder in construction. They were genuine 4th dynasty work, attempting to imitate earlier structures they didn't fully understand. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. Megalithic structures in Britain and Brittany, massive stone circles and burial chambers are attributed to Neolithic peoples around 3000 before Christ or earlier. Yet the astronomical alignments built into these structures demonstrate knowledge of solar and lunar cycles that supposedly wasn't formalized until much later. Stonehenge, for example, aligns with the summer solstice sunrise and contains sightlines that track the 18.6-year lunar cycle. Who were these primitive people who understood such things well enough to encode them in monuments requiring thousands of tons of stone to be moved and placed with precision. In every case, Orthodox scholarship assumes that ancient peoples were constantly inventing things for the first time: writing, mathematics, astronomy, engineering. But what if instead they were recovering knowledge that had existed before and been lost? This would explain why so many discoveries appear simultaneously in different regions. Not because of independent invention, but because different peoples were rediscovering the same ancient knowledge their ancestors had once possessed. The flood myths are key to understanding this process. When I began collecting accounts of great floods from ancient texts, I expected to find the biblical story repeated with minor variations. Instead, I found hundreds of distinct flood traditions from cultures around the world, many of which could not have borrowed from each other due to geographic separation. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years, tells of Utnapishtim, who survived a great flood sent by the gods. The Greek tradition speaks of Deucalion's flood. The Egyptians remembered a time when the waters covered the earth. Roman writers collected flood legends from the Celts of Gaul and Britain. Travelers returning from the Indies brought stories of ancient floods from peoples there. Each culture remembered a catastrophic inundation that destroyed the previous world. The standard scholarly explanation is that floods are common natural disasters, so it's unsurprising that many cultures have flood myths. But this explanation fails to account for the specific details shared across these traditions. The flood covered the whole earth. It destroyed an earlier civilization. Only a few survivors escaped to rebuild. These survivors preserved knowledge from before the flood. These are not generic flood stories, but specific traditions about a civilization-ending catastrophe. The most logical explanation is that they preserve folk memory of actual events, the flooding that occurred as the last ice age ended, approximately 11,700 years ago, when sea levels rose by more than 300 feet as the glaciers melted. Any coastal civilization existing at that time would have been utterly destroyed. And there were civilizations then. We know this because we have found their settlements, now underwater. Divers exploring the coasts of the Mediterranean have discovered submerged ruins of buildings and harbors from that period. These were not primitive villages, but structured settlements showing planning and engineering skill. How many more such settlements lie beneath the oceans, never to be discovered because they're too deep or too far from shore? The peoples living in these coastal settlements would have had every reason to develop astronomy, navigation by the stars for fishing and trade. They would have needed mathematics for building and commerce. They might have been quite sophisticated. Then the waters rose, slowly at first, but eventually inundating all the coastal lowlands, where the most fertile land and best harbors existed. The survivors fled inland, carrying what knowledge they could. Over generations, living in harsher conditions, away from the sea, they would have lost much. Eventually, their descendants would retain only fragmented memories of the time before the flood, when their ancestors lived differently and knew things now forgotten. Millennia later, when new civilizations arose in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley, they built upon these fragments. They didn't invent writing from nothing. They rediscovered it, working from half-remembered symbols and concepts. They didn't create mathematics from scratch. They reconstructed it from inherited numerical systems. They didn't establish astronomy by starting from zero. They built upon observations handed down through priesthoods that had kept the traditions alive. This is why the earliest civilizations appear so suddenly and so sophisticated. Sumerian writing emerges essentially fully formed around 3200 before Christ. Egyptian hieroglyphics appear at roughly the same time, also showing no clear evolutionary path from simpler forms. The Indus Valley script likewise appears complete. Standard scholarship calls this the Neolithic Revolution, as if humans suddenly became clever enough to invent civilization all at once in several places simultaneously. The alternative explanation, that these weren't inventions but recoveries of knowledge that had existed before, makes far more sense. It explains the sudden appearance of complex systems. It explains the shared flood myths. It explains the advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge possessed by supposedly primitive cultures. But accepting this alternative requires abandoning cherished assumptions about human history and our place in it. It requires admitting that we are not the pinnacle of human achievement, but merely the latest iteration of a cycle that has repeated before and will repeat again. It requires accepting that much of what we think we discovered, our ancestors had already known and lost. My contemporaries cannot accept this. The Church cannot allow it, because it contradicts Scripture's chronology. The philosophers cannot allow it, because it undermines their faith in progress, the belief that humanity steadily advances from primitive beginnings to enlightened modernity. To admit that earlier peoples might have possessed knowledge we had to rediscover is to admit that progress is not guaranteed, that civilizations can fall as well as rise. Yet the plague now killing us proves exactly this point. We thought we were safe, that our knowledge and our God would protect us. Now we die in multitudes, and all our learning cannot save us. In 3 years, since this pestilence first appeared in the East, it has killed perhaps 1/3 of all the people in the Christian world. 1/3 gone, and with them all the knowledge they possessed but never wrote down, all the skills they had but never taught, all the wisdom they gained but never shared. When this plague finally burns out, those who survive will face a diminished world. There will be fewer craftsmen, fewer scholars, fewer farmers, fewer of everyone. Much that we take for granted will need to be relearned. Future generations will look back at our age and wonder how we knew things they have forgotten. They will find our texts and struggle to understand them, just as we struggle to understand the texts of the ancients. And so the cycle continues. This is what I have come to understand in my old age, what all my research has taught me. Human civilization does not progress in a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment. Rather, it moves in vast circles, rising and falling, learning and forgetting, building and destroying. We are not the first to achieve what we have achieved. We will not be the last to lose it.
The evidence for this is written in the stars and stones, in the ancient texts and submerged cities, in the myths we dismiss as fantasy, and the knowledge we claim as innovation. It is there for anyone willing to look honestly, without the blinders of certainty, that we are special, unique, unprecedented.
I have tried to preserve this understanding in my great manuscript, but I know now that the manuscript will likely perish with me. No one will care for 800 pages written by a disgraced scholar. But perhaps this letter, simpler and more direct, might survive. Perhaps someone finding it will be curious enough to investigate what I claim. Perhaps in some future age, when humanity has risen high enough to look back clearly at the past, my words will find an audience ready to hear them. To that future reader, I say this: do not make the mistake my generation made. Do not assume you are the first, the best, the most advanced. Look carefully at what came before. Preserve the knowledge you have, for it is more fragile than you think. Learn from the ruins and the texts and the myths. Understand that you stand on foundations laid by others long forgotten, and that someday others will stand on foundations you are laying now, equally forgotten. The cycle is not a curse, but simply the reality of existence in a world subject to change and catastrophe. Our task is not to escape the cycle, that is impossible, but to maintain memory through it, to preserve what we can for those who come after, to leave signposts for future travellers on the same path we have walked. I have failed in many ways. I neglected my family for my work. I spent money we didn't have on texts and travel. I pursued acceptance from scholars who would never grant it. I watched my wife work herself to exhaustion while I chased ancient mysteries. My children grew up poor because I couldn't let go of my obsession. Helena is dead now. Constantine is dead. Young Marcus and his wife and baby daughter are dead. Theodora alone survives, in a distant village with her baker husband and their children, whom I barely know. I have sacrificed everything for knowledge that my own age considers worthless. Was it worth it? I have asked myself this question many times in these past weeks, as I have sat alone in these empty rooms, everyone I loved gone, my great work ignored and scorned. The honest answer is that I do not know. If this letter survives and eventually helps some future person understand the true pattern of human history, then perhaps my life had meaning beyond my own satisfaction. If it perishes unread, then I have wasted 63 years on a futile quest. But even if no one ever reads these words, even if they crumble to dust or burn in some future conflagration, I do not entirely regret the path I have taken. I have seen things in the ancient texts that few others have seen. I have understood connections that few others have understood. I have stood in the ruins of ancient cities and felt the presence of the forgotten peoples who built them. I have traced the path of knowledge backward through the centuries and millennia, following it to sources my contemporaries cannot accept exist. In doing this work, despite all its costs, I have touched something eternal. Not eternal in the sense of lasting forever, but eternal in the sense of recurring forever. The endless cycle of human striving and forgetting, building and destroying, learning and losing. I have been a witness to the pattern, even if I cannot change it. Now my time as a witness ends. The fever grows worse. My hands shake badly now. You can see it in my writing, which grows less controlled with each paragraph. I estimate I have days left, perhaps only hours if the swellings appear. I will write until I can write no more, setting down everything I think important for you, unknown future reader, to know. Let me tell you about the languages, for this was another thread I followed in my research. We are taught that languages evolve from simple grunts to complex speech, from primitive vocabulary to sophisticated expression. But when you actually examine ancient languages, real ancient languages like Sumerian and Akkadian and Egyptian, you find they are not primitive at all. Sumerian, supposedly one of the first written languages, is incredibly complex. It has 8 noun cases, numerous verb forms, and a sophisticated system for expressing subtle distinctions in meaning. This is not a simple language being developed for the first time. This is a refined language, polished by long use. Moreover, across the ancient languages, there are curious similarities that suggest common origin. Many basic words, mother, father, water, fire, show similar sounds across languages that supposedly developed independently. The word for water is similar in Latin, aqua. Hebrew, mayim, contains the M sound associated with water across many languages. Egyptian, mu. And even in tongues from distant lands the travelers describe. Linguists explain these similarities as coincidence or onomatopoeia. Water sounds make m or da sounds naturally, but the similarities extend beyond such obvious cases. Grammatical structures, counting systems, astronomical terminology, all show patterns suggesting they might derive from an older common source. What if there was a proto-language, spoken by the pre-flood civilization, from which all later languages descended? As that civilization fell and its people scattered, they would have taken their language with them. Over thousands of years of separation, the languages would have diverged, becoming as different as Latin is from Chinese. But deep in their structures and their most basic vocabulary, traces of the common origin would remain. This is speculation, I admit. I could not prove it, but it fits the same pattern I saw everywhere else. Sophistication appearing too early, knowledge emerging too fully formed, similarities across supposedly independent developments, all suggesting inheritance from an older source rather than independent invention. The megalithic structures, too, deserve further attention. These massive stone monuments appear across the world, from Western Europe to North Africa, to the Mediterranean islands, to distant lands beyond. Orthodox scholarship dates them to various periods of the Neolithic and Bronze Age, roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years before Christ. But what if they are older? What if they are remnants of the pre-flood civilization? Markers left by peoples who knew the cataclysm was coming? Consider their construction. Moving stones weighing tens or hundreds of tons requires engineering knowledge, understanding of leverage, of friction, of materials. It requires planning and mathematics to calculate the forces involved. It requires social organization to mobilize the necessary labor. All of these things supposedly evolved gradually as human society developed. But what if they didn't evolve? What if the knowledge required to build these structures already existed, preserved by survivors of the flood who remembered how such things had been done before? This would explain why megalithic construction appears simultaneously in so many places, not because different peoples independently invented the same techniques, but because they were all working from the same inherited knowledge. It would also explain why megalithic building stops. After a certain period, people stopped constructing these massive structures. Why? The standard answer is that they developed more sophisticated building techniques, using smaller stones or bricks or wood. But this assumes progress from crude to refined. What if instead they were losing knowledge? What if the early megalithic structures were built by people who still remembered how to work stone on a massive scale, and later, peoples having lost that knowledge, had to settle for cruder methods? This is the pattern I see repeatedly. early sophistication followed by decline, then gradual recovery. Not progress from simple to complex, but cycling between high and low, over and over. I am growing very tired now. The fever makes thinking difficult, but I must continue while I can. There is more you must know, future reader, if you're to understand what I have learned and why it matters. The catastrophe that ended the previous civilization was flooding caused by rising seas. But that is not the only kind of catastrophe that can destroy human civilization. The ancient texts record others. Plagues like the one now killing us, famines caused by climate changes, volcanic eruptions that darken the skies and cool the earth, wars that devastate entire regions. Each of these has happened before. Each will happen again. The plague I now suffer from may have struck before in earlier cycles. We have records of plagues from ancient times, though we assume they were different diseases than what we now face. Climate changes have brought drought and famine repeatedly through history. Volcanic eruptions are recorded in many sources. The point is that catastrophe is not exceptional but normal. Civilization exists in the intervals between catastrophes, rising during stable periods and falling when stability ends. We fool ourselves into thinking we are permanent, that our cities and our knowledge and our way of life will endure forever. Then something happens. Flood, plague, famine, war, and we discover how fragile we really are. I watch this happen now in Constantinople. 3 years ago, this city was vibrant, crowded, wealthy, a center of commerce and learning, home to perhaps 500,000 souls. Now perhaps 1/3 are dead. Streets are empty. Houses stand abandoned. The markets have little to sell because farmers and merchants are dead. The university is closed because the teachers and students are dead. The churches hold fewer worshippers each week as more succumb. In another generation, those who survive will rebuild, but they will have lost much. The skills of craftsmen who died without passing on their knowledge. The books and manuscripts that mouldered in empty houses or were burned by fearful mobs. The accumulated wisdom of teachers who died before they could teach. The city will recover, but it will be diminished. And so it goes, cycle after cycle. Civilization rises, reaches heights of achievement, then falls to catastrophe. The survivors rebuild, eventually reaching similar heights, then fall again to some new catastrophe. Knowledge is gained, lost, and regained, over and over. The question I have pondered in these final days is whether the cycle can be broken. Can humanity preserve knowledge through catastrophe? Can we build systems robust enough to survive the periodic disasters that destroy civilizations? My answer is uncertain. We can try. We can write things down and preserve them in multiple copies in multiple places. We can train many people in essential knowledge so that even if most die, some survivors will remember. We can build structures meant to endure for thousands of years, encoding knowledge in their very design so that future peoples might decipher it. But ultimately, we cannot prevent catastrophe. The Earth's climate changes. Diseases emerge and spread. Volcanoes erupt. Societies fall into war and chaos. These things will happen regardless of our wishes. What we can do is face this reality honestly. We can stop pretending we are exempt from the processes that destroyed earlier civilizations. We can prepare for catastrophe by preserving knowledge in durable forms. We can learn from the past instead of dismissing it as primitive. This is what I hope you will do, future reader. Look at the evidence I have described. Seek out the ancient texts and read them for yourself. Examine the ruins and the structures and the artifacts with fresh eyes without assuming you already know what they mean. Consider the possibility that you are not the first but the latest in a long series of risings and fallings. And when you have understood this, preserve what you know. Write it down, teach it to others, build monuments that might survive. Do whatever you can to pass knowledge forward through time, because someday, perhaps in your lifetime, perhaps long after, catastrophe will come again, and those who survive will need what you have preserved. This is the most important thing I have learned. We are not separate from the cycle of history, but part of it. We rise on the knowledge of those who came before, and we fall preparing the way for those who come after. To accept this is not to despair, but to understand our true role. We are links in a chain reaching backward and forward through time, connecting the forgotten past to the unknown future. I can write no more. The trembling in my hands has grown too severe, and the fever clouds my mind. I have said what I needed to say, set down the essential understanding that cost me 42 years and everything I loved to achieve. To whoever finds this letter, whether in a year or a century or 1,000 years, I entrust this knowledge. Use it well. Remember the pattern. Preserve what you can, and when your own time of catastrophe comes, as it surely will, face it with the understanding that others have faced similar trials before, and that others will face them again after you are gone. We are not the first. We are not the last. We are merely the current turn of the wheel, which has turned before and will turn again. This is the eternal return, the cycle without end, the pattern that governs all human civilization. May you see it more clearly than my generation did, and may you act more wisely upon what you see. I am Marcus Cornelius Viridius, scholar and scribe, father and husband, witness to the pattern, keeper of the memory. I write this on the 14th day of March, in the year of our Lord 1348, in the city of Constantinople, as the plague takes my life as it has taken everything else. I leave these words for you, unknown friend in an unknown age, in the hope that they will help you understand what I have learned, and perhaps preserve it better than I could. The lamp is dying now. I can barely see the page, but it is enough. I have said what I needed to say. The rest is in your hands, future reader. May you use it well. May you remember what my age forgot. May you preserve what I could not. And may you face your own trials with the courage of those who understand that they are not alone in history, but part of something vast and ancient and eternal. The wheel turns, the cycle continues. We forget and remember and forget again. But somewhere in the turning, if we try hard enough and care deeply enough, we can preserve fragments of truth to light the way for those who follow. This is all I have done. This is all any of us can do. Farewell, unknown friend. May you live in more fortunate times. May you see more clearly than we did. May you remember. The pen fell from Marcus's fingers. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted beyond measure. The letter was complete. 12 pages of closely written text, containing everything he had learned compressed into a form he hoped might survive and be understood. Outside, the bells of Hagia Sophia rang for Compline, the last prayers of the day. The 9th hour had passed. It was nearly midnight on the 14th of March. Tomorrow would be the 15th day of March, The Ides, by the old Roman reckoning, an appropriate day for endings. Marcus carefully folded the letter and sealed it with wax. On the outside he wrote simply, "To whoever finds this, the testament of Marcus Cornelius Viridius, scholar, written in the year 1348, in the time of the Great Plague. Read and remember." He placed the sealed letter in a copper tube he had prepared for this purpose, along with several other documents, a copy of his credentials from his time at the Imperial Library, a short autobiography explaining who he was and what he had studied, and a single page listing the most important ancient texts he had consulted in case someone wanted to verify his claims. The copper tube he sealed with pitch, making it waterproof and airtight. Then, despite his weakness, he carried it down the stairs and out into the empty street. The night was cold and clear, the stars brilliant overhead, the same stars the ancients had watched, encoding their positions and movements in records Marcus had spent a lifetime studying. He made his way slowly through the deserted streets to the ruins of the ancient harbour works, built in the time of Constantine I, 1,000 years earlier. There, among the crumbling stone piers and abandoned warehouses, he found what he sought, a gap in the foundation of an old building, a small cavity where the stones had shifted over the centuries. Marcus placed the copper tube carefully in this cavity, then sealed the opening with stones and mortar he had brought for this purpose. The work took the last of his strength. When it was done, he sat for a moment on the cold stones, looking out over the dark waters of the Golden Horn, breathing heavily. He had done what he could. The letter was preserved as well as he knew how to preserve it. Whether anyone would ever find it was in the hands of fate or God or whatever force governed the universe and the cycles of human civilization. Marcus made his way slowly back to his empty rooms as the first light of dawn began to show in the eastern sky. He would not live to see another sunset. He was certain of that now. The swellings had appeared during the night, dark and painful in his armpits and groin. The final stage had begun, but he had finished his work. He had written his testament. He had hidden it for the future. Whatever came now, he could face it, knowing he had done his duty to the truth as he understood it. He lay down on his bed as the sun rose on the 15th of March, 1348, and closed his eyes for the last time. In his final moments, he thought not of the fame he had never achieved, or the recognition that had been denied him, but of the pattern he had seen, the vast, eternal cycle of rising and falling, learning and forgetting that governed all human civilization. We are not the first, he thought as consciousness faded. We are not the last. We are simply one more turn of the wheel, which has turned before and will turn again. The wheel turns. The cycle continues. We forget and remember and forget again. But now, at least, there was one more voice added to the chorus of those who had seen the pattern and tried to preserve the knowledge of it. One more witness to the eternal return. One more letter hidden away, waiting for the future reader who might understand. In the empty room, Marcus Cornelius Viridius, forgotten scholar, drew his final breath and joined all those who had come before him, the ancient peoples he had studied, the lost civilizations he had discovered, the countless humans who had lived and died through all the cycles of history, each believing they were unique, none realizing they were all part of the same endless pattern. The sun rose higher, The city stirred to life, such life as remained in it, and in the ruins of the ancient harbor, sealed in copper and stone, a letter waited patiently for a future that might never come, or might come tomorrow, or might come 1,000 years hence. The testament of a forgotten scholar, the witness of one who had seen. The last letter of Marcus Cornelius Viridius, keeper of the memory, believer in the eternal return, who had sacrificed everything to understand the pattern and preserve knowledge of it for those who might some day be ready to hear. The wheel turns, the cycle continues, and somewhere, hidden in stone and sealed in copper, truth waits for its time to be discovered again.